Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Sheehan Show with me, Sean Sheehan, here on Sherdog.com. And today I want to bring you a bit of an overview show, honestly, because we're just coming off of 2 weeks off, a weekend off, however we want to say it. It's probably a weekend off for fans, and maybe 2 weeks off for some of the media, at least, anyway. And it kind of got me thinking. You know, I love looking at kind of the overall trends of MMA, and to have kind of maybe a weekend off or even a couple of days where you're not analysing fights and looking ahead and spending maybe your off time from actually like creating content or whatever it might be, preparing for that creation of content or preparing for the fights upcoming, gives you a chance to maybe think about other things and look into other things. And one thing that I really kind of looked at over the last couple of weeks is just fight cards themselves and all around fight cards, and kind of maybe the trends that are happening with fight cards these days. And it's really, and when I say overview, I mean overview. Today I'm going to look at some of the cards and an overview of the top of the cards, and maybe I'll dive into actually a few of the cards itself in the second half of the podcast here to talk about specific lineups of specific cards. But what I want to start off here with is talking about the headliners and what decides a headliner, and why the UFC or Bellator or whoever it might be, might decide who is in the headlining act here. Now, this is one where I said the UFC and Bellator there because it kind of has to be them. The PFL has their their tournaments. So if Kayla Harrison's on the card, she's headlining at that weight class. If it's, maybe Rory McDonald and he's the biggest, it's down to the weight class. They do maybe 2 weight classes, and 1 week 2 weight classes, and next week 2. So they don't really count, if you want to put it that way. If it gets to the very end, and let's say it's, I don't know, to Jeremy Stevens versus Anthony Pettis, something, that's probably going to be the main event in the finale if it's for the belt or whatever. So it's very different with them, and also some of the more regional promotions, even Cage Warriors and others, where they don't really have a heavyweight division, not many light heavyweights and stuff. It's mostly going to be the middleweights to 135ers. So this is mostly the UFC and Bellator. And even with Bellator, you could say they don't have the most stacked heavyweight division. But having said that, let's dive into a little bit of it anyway. And one thing I noticed is that there seems to be a disproportionate amount of UFC heavyweight headliners than in the other divisions. And it's a thing that it's look, I've written down here a couple of bullet points, like what I'm going to talk about here. And my first one is kind of, is it understandable that you would put heavyweights in that spot? And I think, to not think about it too much, you'd probably say, yeah, it probably is. Look, people like a heavyweight fight, people like big knockouts, people like the big boys gone in there fighting. And also, I think another point to that as well there is that there is kind of so much turnover at heavyweight that you probably know, if it's a Rosenstruck or a Volkov or a Blades or a Derek Lewis, you probably know them, even if they're not at the very, very top upper echelon with the likes of Ngannou and others. You know them from maybe fighting them, or you know them from the last headliner and all of that. But is that which comes first, the chicken or the egg in that scenario? So let me just give you a couple of shouts at a few of the events that have happened upcoming and that have happened over the last year in the UFC with heavyweight headliners. So upcoming, we have Blades versus Aspinall, which is obviously the London main event. Volkov versus Rosenstruck just happened there. If you go back down through the last couple of weeks, we had Blades versus Dawkins, which happened back in March. In the week before that, we had Volkov versus Aspinall. We have a lot of light heavyweights as well, I found. We have Santos versus Ankalaev, Walker versus Hill as well. Then we had, obviously, the heavyweight title fight of Ngannou versus Gane is going to be a main event. When that happens, that happened back in January. Then we had Lewis versus Dawkins towards the end of last year as well. We had the light heavyweight main event of Blachowicz versus Teixeira back in October. And, I could keep going on. We had Smith versus Spann. And Lewis versus Gane, if you want to go back to August of last year, and go on and on and on and on. So there's lots of heavyweight main events. Now you look through the other cards, and let's say we even look at the couple coming up here. We've Teixeira versus Prochazka obviously coming up this weekend is the light heavyweight fight. Then we've Kattar versus Emmett. We have Adesanya versus Cannonier. We've Dos Anjos versus Fiziev. All different weight classes there. Then Pena versus Nunes, and then before that we have Blades versus Aspinall. So if you look through like all of that, okay, it's well spread out. But the events before it feels like there are maybe it's 30% heavyweight fights. Maybe it's a little bit less than that, but there aren't 30% heavyweights in the UFC compared to the other fighters. Now, when you look at that, right, that's with the UFC. Look at Bellator then. So their events in 2022. Well, we have Bader versus Moldavsky, which is for the belt, obviously in that division. When you see Bader fighting, that that he's going to be the champion, both when it's the heavyweight title fight as well, and that one obviously is going to be champion. So that is the one heavyweight fight that they have had this year in the main event. They have Gracie versus Storley, Mousasi versus Vanderford, Borrocks versus Burnell, McKee versus Pitbull 2, Velasquez versus Carmouche, Cyber versus Blinko 2, obviously Bader versus Congo, there's 2 for the championship as well, and MVP versus Storley as well. So 2 championship fights are the only ones they've had as main events. Now, you could say, okay, everyone is a championship fight, but it's not. The Borrocks versus Burnell fight wasn't a championship fight. Gracie versus Storley, that was in short notice, not a championship fight as well. And I'm sure maybe they could have got, moved other things around to have other things in main events. Last year as well, you Pettis versus Haraguchi, Cyber versus Kavanagh, Queally versus Pitbull 2, Fedor versus Johnson. Okay, Fedor in the main event as a heavyweight, Nimkov and Glikis, Lima, MVP, Davis, Romero, Congo, Haritanov. Obviously, there's another one there, Mousasi versus Salter, and Johnson versus Moldavsky as well, and that was the only heavyweight fight for the rest of it. So around 4 out of 18 for last year. So I would say around the same last year, and maybe a little bit less this year. So it's Bellator and the UFC are both doing it kind of here. I would say Bellator a little bit less, but the UFC a lot. And I'll ask you the reasons. Do fans like it? I would say, some fans probably like it. If you were to put it to, do the hardcore fans like it? Is this what the hardcore fans want in their main events? I would probably say no for the most part, especially because it's 5 rounds, right? And if you have, say, mid-level heavyweights, and I get into the divisions in a second, and maybe compare numbers versus numbers and see which people would prefer in the main event slot, would the hardcore fans who know more about MMA, who's watching UFC Fight Night Vegas 59, would they prefer that? I would say probably no. So what is, for years, the UFC told us they were creating these cards, they were doing these things for us, for the fans, to have the cards that we want, to please us, to give us exactly what we need. And I don't know, I don't think that's as true as it once was. I definitely don't think it's true anymore. So what is the reason they're doing it? Well, the reason they're doing it, I would say, is because they have already been paid the money. ESPN pays them the money for the pay-per-view cards. They pay them the money for the cards they're putting on TV. And, that's that, basically. So do they need to actually, think about it? Do they need to really delve into what the fans want? Do they really need to delve into what it's going to be, what we need long-term in terms of the next card that's coming up in 6 weeks' time? No, my answer would probably be yes, but do they think they do? I would say probably, they probably say they do as well, but in practice of what we're seeing, is that the case? I would say probably no. And I would say probably no to that. I think there's a certain laziness in the UFC more so than any. Now, we went through the Bellator cards there as well. It's the title fights for Bellator, and it is the Fedor fight, so it's not as much there. They don't really have as many. You'd one Congo fight or whatever, but that was a number 1 contender fight. They don't have the 7 versus 9 or the 3 versus 5 or whatever it might be as title fights. And the reason I think the UFC are happy enough to do that is, I'll say it again, because of that money. And the fact it's already there, and the fact that they don't need to push the next star to become the next guy, to become the next, star again, let's say it. Because, look, Derek Lewis or Volkov or Rosenstruck, whoever it might be, is not going to become the next star. Derek Lewis has become a bit of a star, and I think he's done a great job, but he's not going to become... he's not going to become a McGregor or a Jones or Khabib, or even, an Adesanya maybe, someone who's kind of a burgeoning star, but is a star probably at a certain level, or a Cyborg or whatever it might be. Whereas, like, someone in an upcoming division, and as I said, we look at the divisions in a second now, they could. And why not push them in that spot instead of a heavyweight in the spot there? Now, let's forget about heavyweights for a second, and we will roll back to it. But if you're looking at the overall building of these cards, why not build it in such a way that it's a card you're already paid for, right? You are not obliged to do much with that card except, put out however many fights, however many hours, however many minutes on that night for ESPN or ESPN Plus, or what is it, ABC in America or whatever it is. You're obliged to do that, but why not build yourself for the future in a better way? Like, this ESPN deal won't last forever. Now, they might re-up the deal, but when you are re-upping the deal, let's have Fox trying to come back and get it. Let's have the USA Network trying to get it. Let's have Amazon try to get it. Let's have Netflix try to get it, or whoever it might be, try to bid for this so you get more money. Oh, and what's the best way to earn more money, to have more of a valuable product in terms of what you can do with the fights itself? Now, they do a great job behind the scenes, and everything they've done to build the promotion has been absolutely fantastic, and I'm not talking about that at all. Dana White says people like me having a clue about that part of the business, and from my point of view, he's absolutely right. I haven't a clue about that part of the business. It looks great from where I see it. They're doing great there, but what I have a clue about is watching fights and watching it through years, and know what fans want, and know what fans want to consume, and know what will happen in the future if you have placed the people in the right place throughout the years. And it feels like they're not doing that right now. They're not placing the right people in the right place at the very top of the cards to bring them on, to get them to that next level. It feels like there is almost too much of the tried and trusted, if you get me. There's no chances being taken. Like, I don't know. Let me look at the rankings here, and let me see, like, a few people, even on the way up, someone like Yair Rodriguez in a main event, which we have seen before. But I think they need to do more of that. They need to put Sean O'Malley into a main event. Now, do I necessarily think he'll be a champion and he'll defend the belt forever? Maybe not, or you probably don't, and maybe I do. It doesn't really matter at this stage. But push him. Promote someone, push them into that top spot, lift them up, and in 5 years' time, or in 5 months' time or something, they might be this massive star, and then you have someone created, and you could say, look, they have headline there, this fight brought them there, and we helped to make them a star. If you look at the UFC stars throughout the last few years, a lot of them have been self-made. Like, you look at Chris Cyborg. She came into the UFC as a monster. Ronda Rousey very much pushed her way to become a star. I would say that Conor McGregor's probably the greatest example ever of pushing himself to become a star with his documentary and with his social media presence, and with the fact he took fights very quickly and everything like that. But if you look at all three of those people I just mentioned as well, the headlining spots, the big spots, the fights made them the star that they became. If McGregor hadn't been pushed into big fights, would he become the star he became? If Ronda Rousey hadn't been given the main event slot against Carla Esparza at that, Liz Carmouche at that time, would she have become the star? No, maybe, probably would have been. But I really think that happens. Now, Cyborg was a bit different. She was already kind of a star at that stage when she came to the UFC, but I would love that. Like even someone like a Jack Shore or a Volev or Jamal Hill. We've seen a bit of it now. The higher weight classes we do see a bit of it with, like Aspinall. Look at Aspinall, perfect example, a great example. Aspinall's been given a main event. He's another main event coming up, and look at him. People are talking about him as a star. People view him as a star. He's getting traction now in England and stuff, and he's becoming one of those guys. Like give Sean Brady a main event. Look at the big fight for Hamzat Chimaev. Look how much of an additional star that made him to fight Gilbert Burns in that very tough fight. Even though, okay, it wasn't a main event, but still, it was a big fight and a big card. And we'll get more to that in a second. But it is there, and they can do it, and it can happen. And I think they need to do more of it. And the example is there itself. As I said, with heavyweight, they have set the example at heavyweight for the up-and-coming guys. Now, it's grand to do it at heavyweight for the up-and-coming guys. My problem at heavyweight is for the kind of the tried and tested guys. Like do we really need, like last week, Volkov versus Rosenstruck in the main event? Do we really need like Derek Lewis versus whoever it might be in the main event? Like, let me just pull up the division here, and let's say, look, they put Derek Lewis versus Rosenstruck in a main event, or they put Volkov versus Curtis Blades in a main event, or whatever. Do we really need to see that, like, in a main event? Do we really need to see that over 5 rounds, or would you rather see? Okay, let's do it this way. So Volkov is 7, Rosenstruck is 8. Let's look at 7 and 8 in other divisions, right? So at 135. Rob Font versus Dominic Cruz. Would that be? Well, imagine that as a 5-round main event. What a fight that'd be. That'd be absolutely fantastic. Josh Emmett versus Giga Chikadze. That'd be a great 5-round main event. Rafael Dos Anjos versus Conor McGregor. This is okay. I think I was lucky getting 7 and 8 here. Wonderboy Thompson versus Masvidal. There you go. Now these are not maybe necessarily up and comers, but as a fight night main event, there's nothing wrong with that either. Jack Hermanson versus Darren Till, Reyes versus Craig. In the women's divisions, Andrade versus Rodriguez. I think that'd actually be a good main event. Ansarov versus Torres, Araujo versus Maya. But then, there's others. You could put, say, Tyler Santos obviously fighting for the title coming up, like her versus an Andrade or something like that, or Mackenzie Dern versus, Zhang Wei Li, or whatever it might be. There are some fight, like Mackenzie Dern, I think, is a great example as well. She is someone, okay, she may not have had the best career in terms of winning or going on runs and everything like that, but she's a star. She's she's someone people like. She's someone people know. Why not push her a little bit? Or why not push Rodriguez a little bit? Why not push them into a main event? I think that is something that they really need to do a little bit better, and I think it's something that it's not a massive change in what the UFC are doing, but I think it could be a massive change in what they have upcoming in the future. And look, when you look at Bellator as well, it is a little bit easier because there are less cards. And I said there, when you're looking through the cards, maybe Bellator have a similar percentage of heavyweight fights or fights, like that. But the fact that they have a lot less cards doesn't make it seem as overwhelming maybe as the UFC. And maybe putting on less cards is the answer. No, I think we'd all probably agree that less cards would be great. The UFC are not going to do that, especially the fact that they've already been, been paid the money to put on those cards. So for at least the next, is it 2 more years? I think it might be 2 more years. I'm not sure, but however long the ESPN, maybe it's 3 years, this ESPN deal is going, they're going to have that amount of cards anyway. So that's nothing we can hope for. And it's not even us as fans or, media or whatever. I think it's for the UFC themselves. I think having too many fighters on the roster, having too many fights, it has led to kind of a degradation in the quality maybe of the overall product. Like I always say it with Ferrari and Fiat, they're the same company, but one's called a Fiat, one's called a Ferrari, and you know the difference between a Ferrari and a Fiat very, very well, don't you? Before, it used to be a UFC fighter and a regional fighter. Now there isn't that much of a difference between a regional fighter and a UFC fighter in terms of a large percentage of the UFC fighters. We see all the time, this is Dana White Contender Series fighter. It might be a fighter who's 5-0 or 5-1 or 3-5 or 3-0 or something like that on the cards. No, that's not to say they're not a good fighter or anything like that, but that's not to say they are a good fighter either. Like, say, someone like a Paul Hughes on the way up as a featherweight could be better than a large percentage right now, even though he's still only on his way up, of the UFC roster, because they maybe have been signed to earlier, have come from the Dana White Contender Series. So there's a guy out there who is, rising to become a Ferrari, and maybe there's a load of Fiats ahead of him in the road, if you want to put it that way, And I don't think that's good for the UFC, because the UFC should be the apex. The UFC should be the number one in the world, and they still are. But they also have like this, magnificent front of the car, and then the back is all bashed in. And I think that is a big issue for them. And my main point here around like the top of the cards and around how cards are maybe put out is, when you have that, when you have like the lower level as not as strong as it once was, and then you have the top level where you're showing maybe a weaker hand than you actually have, then that makes the whole product look bad altogether. And I don't think that's good at all. So let's quickly look. I said I'd look at the kind of maybe the layout of cards. And let's do that for the last couple of pay-per-views maybe. So you look at UFC 274. You had Oliveira versus Gaethje and Esparza versus Namajunas. Okay, that turned out to be the way it was. But then you had Michael Chandler, Tony Ferguson as well. Now, to me, that is the perfect top three fights. If you were to pick out any three fights for the card to put in the top three, you put the two title fights, the premier title fight, I would say, in the top. Actually, now, this was before the weight miss. After Oliveira missed the weight, I would have put Esparza versus Namajunas. Thankfully, they didn't, because of the way that fight turned out. But I think that would have been the right way to go. Anyway, we'll forget about that, and we'll forget about the weight miss. But the two title fights and your main banger of a fight, third from the top. Some places like WWE, even when they're putting their cards, and I'm sure other MMA promotions as well, they put maybe a sleeper fight in the middle, give people a chance to kind of recoup and get back into it then. Then after that, they had OSP versus Shogun Rua. Now, that's a fight that didn't turn out to be great, but that's a fight I wouldn't have had there either. Like, let's put that as the main event in the prelims, and let's put a banger, Rival versus Schnell in that position. Let's push one of those guys. Whoever wins that is only a couple of fights away from fighting for the title at flyweight. Let's put that in there. Let's put Lupi Godinez in there. Andre Filo is a guy who's rising up and looks really good. Put him in that spot. And then you have the opener versus Randy Brown versus Chaos Williams, which everyone thought might be a banger, opening the card. There's nothing wrong with that, I don't think. Look, sometimes, and I understand why they put OSP versus Shogun Rua in there, because it is name value, and I understand that. They put Trinaldo versus Roberts, which was destined to be a good fight and had some name value as well, on the top of the prelim card. So I think that they did a good job of that one. They did a good job of showing where that should be. Now let's take one that wasn't great. Volkov versus Aspinall. So they had Volkov versus Aspinall as the main event, and they had Aaron Lallin versus Dan Hooker as the co-main event. Paddy Pimblett versus Kazula Vargas after that. They had Gunny Nelson versus Sato, Molly McCann versus Louis Carolina, Ilya Topuria versus Herbert. Now, Ilya Topuria versus Jai Herbert, that's the perfect fight to open up the main card as well. It's a banger of a fight. They like doing that. I agree with that. I think that's good as well. The top of the prelims, they had Makwan Amirkhani versus Mike Grundy. Turned out to be a 57-second submission. Beforehand, maybe I didn't think that'd be the most amazing fight, but still it worked out well. They were right. They put it in the right position. Now, below that, you have Pavlovich versus Abdurrahimov, fair enough. But you have Paul Craig versus Nikita Krylov. You have Jack Shore versus Timur Valiev. And, you have Makayev, who's a massive star. He's opening the card. No problem with that. It was his first fight against Cody Durden. They probably should recognize how big of a star this guy could be, but forget about that for a second. Right. I think the biggest issue here is Paul Craig against Nikita Krylov, and I kind of argued against light heavyweight fights being given a bigger showing, but Paul Craig has been on such a run recently that the fact that he's buried in those prelims is ridiculous. Like, if you look at it, since 2019 he's won 5 and drawn 1 against Shogun, and he's gone on and beat Shogun after that, beat Jamahal Hill, who's one of the top guys in the world, and obviously this is including the Krylov fight in that one. Why are you not pushing Paul Craig? Like, Paul Craig is a guy who can go to Glasgow and headline a card. He's a guy who will put on an exciting fight against the guys at the top of the division. And he's buried, 7th, 8th, 9th even, 9th on the card in the middle of the prelims. He's a ranked guy right up there. Let me just check where he is in the rank. He's probably risen a bit since then, but he's right up there towards the top of the rankings in number 8. He was probably 10 or 11 before this, maybe 9. and you put him in that spot. I think that's one of those ones that makes no sense. I feel like that's one of the ones where they just threw names at the wall. Dana White has it behind him. There's Paul Craig and there. Grant thought about it no more. We have the card, and then everyone's watching like, what's Paul Craig doing there? You know, when you have, Gunny Nelson versus Sato. Gunny's on his way back. We know how good Gunny is, and he's been around. Does he need to be in that spot? Like, he's not a UK fighter. There's probably not a lot of people travelling over from Iceland to watch him fight, or Ireland maybe even. Could Gunny have been in the top spot of the prelims maybe and push Paul Craig up there? I think probably that would have been okay. Or maybe even the Molly McCann fight, put her as the top fight of the prelim card and push him in there. Like, you needed Paddy, you needed Allen, you needed Aspinall in the top. Absolutely. I think you needed to show respect to your ranked guy in one of your top divisions and put him in there. And I think that is something that the UFC made a big mistake on. And finally, let's look at one of the other pay-per-view cards, UFC 273, where they had obviously the top two fights as well, Volkanovski, Sterling, and then Chimaev versus Burns, and then Mackenzie Dern versus Torres, and Madsen versus Michelle. That to me is perfect, right? They did a great job with that. They had Ian Gary as well as the top of the prelim card against Darian Wiggs. Absolutely perfect. That's even, I talked about there maybe a Gunny Nelson maybe in the prelims. They had Raquel Pennington versus Aspen Ladd there. A similar sort of fight, I would say, in that sort of spot, and I think that made a lot of sense. This is the sort of thing they need to do. And when it's a card like this, and that's the funny thing, and I said it earlier about putting Aspinall into big spots, they can do it when they need to do it, They can do it when they need to do it. And this was one of the big cards of the year. This is the one where Chimaev was becoming the guy, and where Volkanovski was fighting, against Chan Sung Jung. We had a massive rematch between Sterling and Yan. This was the fight card that they needed, that they needed to be big, and they did it in that. So they can do it, and that almost makes other cards more disappointing. But overall, and to kind of end it out here, I think it's an issue that maybe people don't think about all that very much, UFC included. But I also think it's an issue that the UFC could alleviate and could fix very, very quickly, and it'd be better for the fans, it'd be better for the UFC, and you know what? It'd be better for the future of the sport. Alright everyone, I will leave it there. If you enjoyed this, let me know, and I'll do more things like this. Let me know any topics you want discussed or anything you want to talk about. I've obviously done a lot about judging and a lot of previews for the cards and stuff, but I want to do kind of free-form chats like this as well, to kind of go through things and maybe delve into them a little bit more. So we'll leave it at that. My name is Sheehan for Sherdog.com, and I'll see you all next time.